Good day to our viewers today. A very warm welcome from a warm and sunny Johannesburg to each and every one of you dialing in today. And yes, spring is knocking at our door. I will just wait for a minute or so as I wait for the viewers to come in. I think we have around 179 participants. So I'm just going to wait for just 10 seconds, and then we get to go. Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion webinar. I'm very excited today. My name is Fikile Mbokota, CEO of Cetrix, and I'm delighted to be hosting this, our 12th installment of the Index More series. Together with our partners, Blackrock's iShares, we aim to offer thought leadership on everything indexing and more. In the past, we've covered diverse topics, including investing in China, infrastructure investing, as well as thematic investing, to name but a few. Today, we will be talking about how diversity and inclusion can drive the adoption of ESG practices in South Africa. As always, you're welcome to use the Q&A functionality on your screen by clicking on the text message button at the top of your screen. And also remember to stay online for the full duration of the webinar to potentially earn yourself some much deserved CPD points. Now back to the topic of diversity and inclusion. In the coming years, there's expectation that the S element of the ESG will be heightened. Yes, and this is mainly because COVID has reminded us of the inequality that exists in the world and has brought forward social issues which were perhaps slightly overlooked. Adding to that is the Sustainable Developmental Goals by the UNPRI, which also highlight the need for diversity and inclusion in the workplaces, amongst other concerns. Now, as we close off Women's Month in South Africa tomorrow, we thought it opportune to talk about the importance of the S in ESG investing. Yes, this time, this month, and yes, this hour, we are putting social right slap bang in the middle of ESG. And this is mainly because the current environment has left investors considering and wanting more of sustainable products and organizations that demonstrate commitment to society when deciding on their investment strategy. Investors are looking for companies that enable them not only to make a difference to their returns, but to improve socioeconomics. From a company's perspective, however, it's about providing social opportunities such as employee wellness and equitable access, and how that drives the production of the bottom line of the business by employing more productive, more driven employees. So, how do we start thinking about the inclusion of all people from diverse backgrounds and how that can drive the performance of your business? Because you can be diverse and not inclusive. We at Cetrix have built a Cetrix Inclusion and Diversity Exchange Traded Fund that addresses the mega trend of demographics and social change in South Africa. The ETF offers investors the ability to invest in 30 of South Africa's most inclusive, diverse, and performance-focused companies listed on the JSE based on key metrics. We believe that diversity matters and inclusion wins. If it's offshore exposure that you want, Cetrix, in connection with iShares, have built a suite of ESG ETFs that are trading on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in rands and offer local investors an easily accessible, low-fee rand hedge through our unique offering. Our Cetrix MSCI World ESG and Cetrix MSCI Emerging Market ESG ETFs have both been designed to maximize exposure to positive environmental, social, and governance factors. Now, I'm excited because today we deviate somewhat from the past webinars by, instead of hearing from portfolio managers, we introduce you to the people. Wait, we introduce you to the ladies that are making headways in the diversity and inclusion space. Now, let's find out how these ladies are driving the quality of diversity and inclusion to drive better outcomes that can enhance societal change. Specifically, we are joined by our esteemed panel of ladies, and we have Rachel Jafta, PhD, Director of NASPERS and Process, and Professor of Economics at Stellenbosch University. In addition, we have Carice Anderson, Director of People Manager Strategy at Blackrock, and last but not least, we have Shamila Subramani, Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSE. Now, before I do that, let's first ask you to join in the discussion by answering the following poll questions. You will now start to see the poll appear on your screen, and the poll asks simply, in your view, is inclusion and diversity driving the adoption of ESG practices in South Africa? You can simply answer yes, or no, or unsure. And let's go. I'm very excited to be joined by a panel of ladies, hosted by a lady, of course, today at this hour in the month of August. Quite fitting, don't you think? As we close off Women's Month for South Africa. And wait, I think it's our first ever webinar with women only serving on our panel. Ladies and gentlemen, the first women-only panel webinar in Cetrix, for Cetrix. And so the answers are coming in. And what's also exciting is that we cover aspects of diversity and inclusion from university to board level. So we're taking it all the way up, and it's going to be a very constructive discussion. Right, now the results have come in, and 41% of you have said yes, 20% of you have said no, and 39% of you have said unsure. So that's quite interesting. Hopefully some of you who have said unsure will be slightly convinced at the end of this webinar. Right, so I think let's move on to our speakers or our panel members. And I'm going to first start with Rachel. As I've mentioned, that we are starting at the bottom and we're starting to look at it from university level. Rachel, welcome to our webinar today.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Rachel, I do have some questions for you, but first of all, I can't believe you have done your PhD in Italian at an Italian university. Can you please help me to pronounce the name of the university?
Thanks, Michaela. And here I was looking forward to you doing the pronunciation.
Okay, I'll do it after you.
It's l'Università degli Studi Luigi Bocconi a Milano, Italia.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I can do that, but let me try. Università degli Studi Luigi Bocconi di Milano.
Bravissima. Bravissima.
Oh. Right. Thank you, Rachel. Now, as I've mentioned that we're starting from the bottom, we're starting at university level, and we are just wanting to look at the topic of diversity and inclusion and how it impacts ESG. Now, you have great passion for tertiary education and work closely with students in your capacity as a professor. How important is career mentorship and being strategic and intentional about your early career choices?
Thank you for that question. It's no doubt that I am a firm believer in the incredible power of education to unlock and develop potential. But I know from my own experience that this doesn't happen automatically. So if I can just take a little bit of time to give context. So I come from a very small town, and my parents didn't have an opportunity to go to school, yet they underscored for us what an opportunity education is. And I learned along the way the value of mentorship, because there were teachers and there were later on at university professors who saw potential and helped to develop that potential. And with that perspective, for me, it is such an exciting opportunity to be able to do that for students at university today. And I must admit that I have a big soft spot for students who are first generation students, because they don't come to university with all the preparation that maybe their peers that come from a different environment come, and they don't have the networks. So I think that mentorship of various forms, it can be informal, can be structured, but definitely needs-based, can play a role when they're on campus, but also once they have finished their degree and they're already starting their career. At Stellenbosch University, it's we have it both voluntary staff and senior students mentoring, but we also have a structured program. And then one of the alumni programs that I participate in is for early career alumni graduates that are in work. And those are very inspiring, because they come to the webinar or in-person events with real life questions that they are struggling about in the workplace. So sometimes it's just decisions, or to hear that their peers are also struggling with the same things, and having mentors that have experience. And sometimes it's mentors that are willing to listen, and they will discover the solution themselves by articulating what it is that's bothering them. So to conclude on this one, Fikile, I absolutely believe in the power of education, but supplemented by a really good mentorship.
That's great. No, well done for you for the work that you're doing. Now, as we move from student level to entry level, we see growing diversity and inclusion in junior to middle management roles, but that tends to actually decrease as we go up the leadership hierarchy. Do you view this as an impediment, Rachel, for sustainable business growth?
Thanks, Fikile. I think that it is necessary to have a diverse pipeline, but it's not enough. One has to take the time to focus on matching your strategy for your business or whatever the institution is to the skills that you will not only require now, but also require in future. And then you have to pay attention to the people that you have in your company beyond the traditional, what degrees do they have, what experience do they have, in line with the initial appointment. But especially now with technology moving so fast and we're required to be flexible and adaptable, it does help to think beyond the traditional requirements. I have a beautiful example from one of the companies that's a subsidiary of Naspers, where they're asking, when they look at the pipeline and they look at positions that are available and the people that we have, identifying strengths and gaps, they say, but these skills that we say they must have, are they teachable? And if they are teachable, how are we going to teach it as fast and efficient as possible to get them into more senior positions? And the answer to the is it teachable is yes. Then you have a shorter way to get into more senior positions, because we are not saying you now have to go to university and do another degree. We are at the point where we're accepting nano degrees. So, for example, if you just need skills in data science, you need not go to the university for another 3 years. You can do a nano degree in 1 year and then make progress. But the bottom line is that not only do we need the pipeline, but we need to be able to retain people. And for that to happen is that they must feel that they are valued in the business, that there is mobility, that there is a career path. One of the questions I'm often asked in interaction with young people building their careers is, when will the mundane work stop? And my answer to that is, you have to figure out whether mundane has an end goal. So if mundane is that I have to do this work that I really don't want to do, but it's a stepping stone to something bigger that I do want, then I have to suck it up and do the mundane work. But if the mundane work is a dead end, then I have to seriously think about where else can I take my talents where it will be valued.
No, thank you for that. So basically it takes concerted effort, and you have to be teachable, and you have to be actually valued in the business. Those are great insights. Thank you, Rachel. Now, as we navigate as young corporates, I will ask Carice. Carice, thank you for joining me today. Good morning.
Good morning.
For waking you up. Great to have you with us today. You wrote a book, and in your book, Intelligent Isn't Enough, a Black Professional's Guide to Thriving in the Workplace, you mentioned that intelligent isn't enough to climb up the corporate ladder. What tips do you have for young female professionals that would help them stand out and reach their full potential?
Gile, thanks for the question, and thank you so much for having me as part of today's panel. So I always say that my main goal is to empower professionals to reach their full potential and to democratize access to unwritten rules of success so that people can have more fun, better relationships, and greater impact at work. So with regards to your question, I'm going to answer it in 2 parts. The first part is going to be just some advice that can be summed up in the framework for my book that you've just given the title of. And then number 2, I'm going to talk about sponsorship. So I think, for a lot of us growing up, I think, we got this advice that, go to school and get as many letters behind your name, as many degrees as you can. Work hard, and then, you're going to be knighted as the chosen one. You'll be tapped on the shoulder. And it doesn't really work like that, and that's why I called my book Intelligence Isn't Enough, because honestly, it's not enough. It's not enough to just be smart and to have good grades and to have the right degrees. There are other components to being successful that I think a lot of, I think to Rachel's point, a lot of first generation university students or first generation corporate professionals do not know. I did not know this. I was the first person in my family.
By the way.
Yeah. I was the first person in my family to major in business in university or to work in a corporate. And so I was completely clueless. And so, the framework for my book is know yourself, know other people, know your environment, and then integrate the knowledge of those 3 to build a personal brand and a communication style that allows you to have maximum impact. So if I were to give, female professionals some advice, I would be like, follow that framework. And then the second thing I'll say is sponsorship. So I'll break the framework down into a little bit more detail. So the know yourself part is really about understanding what's your mindset, what's your personal story, where do I come from? What are all of the things that have happened to me, the people that have, crossed my path, that have shaped me into who I am? What are my strengths? What are some of my unhealed traumas, right? Things that I've been through that affect how I show up today. How have I been socialized? What kind of career advice have I been given, right? Even thinking about what is your self-worth rooted in? I think for me, a lot of my self-worth was rooted in achievement. because I'd always been someone who achieved. I always had good grades. I always had better grades than my siblings. So, that was my identity, right? But you don't want to root your identity and your self-worth in achievement, right? Because what happens when you're not achieving and you're not doing well at work, right? You probably become a bit of a monster because because the pain of not doing well, right?
Yeah.
So I think, just to make that a little bit more personal, I grew up in a very patriarchal sort of top-down family. Women were expected to sort of take one for the team, be more docile and not as vocal about what they wanted. You didn't challenge those in authority. And I brought that mindset into my career. And I think there were times that I should have pushed back on certain opportunities as opposed to just taking them because that's what I thought I had to do.
Mm.
I think even this concept, I hear a lot of this in corporate, go above and beyond. I was never taught to go above and beyond. I was taught to do what I was told. And don't do any more than that. So it's a corporate environment and people are judging you because you're not going above and beyond. But if you haven't grown up with that message, that is very foreign to you and you need someone to tell you that. I think, on the know others element, right? That's understanding what do other people expect from you and learning how to work with people who are different than you. I think we love to talk about diversity, in terms of the benefits of it. But let's talk about the challenge. It's hard to work with people who don't think like you, who don't have the same work ethic, who don't have the same values and motivations, right? And nobody really teaches us how to weather the conflict that arises from all of those differences. And I think that's an important skill that people need to learn. And I'll be the first one to tell you, I grew up in a family, like I said, where everything was about degrees and being smart. Nobody ever talked to me about the importance of other people in terms of being successful. So I literally thought, well, I have my brain and I have these pieces of paper that I paid a lot of money for. I'm set. Like, I don't need anything else. I don't need anybody else. I've got those two things, right? And we all know that is not true. You need other people to know, like, and trust you, to want to invest in you, to want to train you up, to give you opportunities, to make sure you maximize those opportunities. And if people don't know, like, and trust you, they're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. Right. And so learning how to build those relationships, I think, is really important. And learning how to, work your way through the conflict and realize you can have conflict and do it in a productive, professional way that deepens the relationship and helps you know the other person better at the end of the day. And then just the third part was just the knowing your environment. Understand what works and doesn't work in the environment that you're in and how do things get done? How do people communicate? How do people handle conflict, right? And I think the better you kind of pull all three of those elements together, the know yourself, know others, and know your environment, then you can start to develop a personal brand and a communication style that's authentic to you. Because I'm a big believer in authenticity, right? I think you can find a way to integrate the knowledge of those three in an authentic way that works for you, but also works for the people that you work with and that works for the organization, right? And I honestly believe if you're missing one of those elements, if you don't know yourself, you don't know other people, you don't know the environment, you are going to struggle, right? You're not going to be able to have the impact that you want to be able to have. And I think that's why it's important to know all three. The last point I'll just mention quickly, which is the second part of my answer, which is sponsorship. I think, and I say this in my book, I think a lot of Black professionals and also other underrepresented groups are over-mentored and under-sponsored. And I mean, for those of you that might be on the call that are like, well, what's the difference? A mentor is somebody who's going to give you good advice, share the wisdom from their own journey, their own lessons learned. A sponsor is got to be somebody who's senior in your organization, who is willing to put their neck on the line for you. That person is going to be in those rooms where you're not. And that's the thing I realize, and I say this in my book. Some of the most important decisions about your career, you won't even be in the room when they're being made. And so you need the people who are in those rooms, who are decision makers, who are influencers, to be able to advocate for you and say, Akile deserves that raise, that bonus, that step up opportunity, that promotion. And I'm going to provide cover for her when she gets it. I'm going to make sure she doesn't fail. And if we don't have that, then we're not going to be as successful as we could be. We're not going to advance in the way that we want to. So we've got to build relationships with those people. And a lot of times those people will not look like us, right? Because, we don't have gender parity in leadership roles, I would say globally, right? And so you're going to have to learn how to build relationships with people who are much older than you, much more senior, a different race, a different gender. Don't allow that to get in the way, those differences. Try to find those common points of interest, right, that you can connect with people on so that you can build that sponsorship.
Mm. Wow, no, that was very powerful and very well said. Now let's take it back to Blackrock, where you employed currently. How, given your role in setting people manager strategy, is inclusion and diversity driving ESG practices for Blackrock? What do you feel are the key points companies can consider to help foster these practices?
Well, I'll start out, specifically talking about my own role. I mean, as you mentioned, I'm the director of people manager strategy, and I was basically hired to think about how do we support, develop, and hold our people managers accountable, right? Because if we, I've seen research from Gallup and Korn Ferry that basically says people managers account for up to 70% of variance in team performance. And if we want to talk about where can we get the most bang for our buck, it is investing in our people managers. People managers are the ones who drive performance. They are the ones that are going to create that inclusive environment that we've been talking about. They are the ones that shape the experience and the perception of a person, right? And I think everybody on this call, could talk about a bad manager they've had. And, that saying is people join organizations, but they leave people managers. So, I mean, the fact that Blackrock has hired me and invested in this, in this space, I think speaks, to their understanding of what is going to give us the most bang for our buck in terms of creating that inclusive environment and in terms of really living up to the culture that we want to really create. Because I think it's important, right? I didn't say this in my last answer, but I think it's important for us to understand there is a shared sense of responsibility. All of the responsibility is not on the person, right? The individual. There's responsibility on the manager and the organization, right? To create the right ecosystem for inclusion, right? And I challenge, all of us to look at, our mentee and sponsor groups and make sure that those groups mirror the demographics of the organization. If your organization is 25% women, your mentee and sponsee groups should be too. Now, I'm not saying you have to kick anybody out of your current groups, but think about expanding them to include people who are different than you, right? And you don't need the organization to change its policies or processes for you to be able to do that. You can start doing that today. Now, in terms of what Blackrock is doing, I mean, I think there are several things, right? I think internally, every person at Blackrock has to have a DEI objective as part of their performance evaluation, right? So that's number one. I think we also have a required people manager curriculum that I'm spearheading the development of. We have 5 courses, and I'll throw out the titles if anybody's interested. We've got being a student of your people, delivering actionable feedback, managing performance, career coaching and development planning, and then managing time and energy. And the topic of inclusion, as opposed to sitting outside and being a separate course, it is woven through all 5 of those courses. And we're requiring all of our people managers to take those 5 courses, right? And the topic of inclusion, it touches on all of those, right? How do I give feedback differently to one person than I do to somebody else? Is the content of that feedback different? Am I spending more time thinking about the feedback that I'm giving to one person than I do to the other, right? How am I evaluating people? Am I, do I let some people make a whole lot of mistakes, but then other people, you make one mistake and I'm done with you, right? So I think thinking about how do we let bias seep into all of our critical decisions and kind of those moments that matter as people managers. I would say the other thing is last year we had all of our employees be required to participate in inclusion dialogues as well. So we've had, I think we've seen a lot of, impact from that, from having those hard conversations. And then we also have our bio fund, where we're investing in, businesses and projects that are owned, led, or serving people of color with a focus on Black, Latinx, and Native American communities in the United States. Then I'll leave it at that.
Yes, you've said a mouthful. Thank you. So basically for employees, it's really about more fun, and better relationships. And if you can do that, then you can try and move up the corporate ladder, right?
Absolutely.
And for employers, it's about creating the right ecosystem to help groom and bring up the employees that have been marginalized. Very powerful. So we are about to move to the next poll, which is, if you can put it up, in your view, do equitable and inclusive principles have a positive impact on workforce and company results? The next poll says, in your view, do equitable and inclusive principles have a positive impact on workforce and company results? So you could answer yes, significant impact, yes, marginal impact, or maybe no, you don't believe that it impacts the results of the workforce. It impacts the results or more workforce morale. Or maybe you're not sure. You can just say, I'm not sure. And I see the poll numbers are coming in. Very interesting. And we're getting there. And yeah, 58% of you have answered yes, significant impact. 32% of you have answered yes, marginal impact. 4% have answered no, I don't believe it impacts the results of workforce morale. And 5% of you have said you're not sure. Thank you for participating in the poll. I'll then move on to our next panelist, Shamila. Shamila, welcome and thank you for coming through.
Thank you so much, Fikile. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I have to just reflect and say, I wish that I was part of the audience so I could just listen to the wonderful gems we've already heard today. And it's just been fascinating. So much of what I think Carice and Rachel spoke to personally was so relatable.
Absolutely.
And, So yeah, just thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Fikile.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Shamila, I mean, there's overwhelming evidence that diversity and inclusion is good for business in general and ESG performance by boosting profits, driving innovation, improving problem-solving capabilities, and enabling growth. In your views, I mean, you work for the JSE, what efforts has the JSE made in influencing the implementation of diversity and inclusion amongst companies listed on the JSE?
Thanks for the question, Fikile. And like I said, I think part of me feels like my job is a little bit more boring, right? After all the wonderful interventions we've heard, because I mean, really, who wants to hear about listings rules? But needless to say, the JSE obviously considers that it does have an influencer role to play, and there's the multiplier effect because of the impact on the market. There's two elements to that. The first one is the lead by example, because we ourselves are a listed company. And so what do we do internally that looks at these issues? I think, just from a gender representation perspective, if you look at the JSE Limited, where we have our second female CEO in succession, which is quite unusual for a financial services company. We're the largest stock exchange on the continent, 17th largest in the world. So I think, from that perspective, already quite an achievement. And then if we look at that on gender again, looking at diversity across all levels, we look at board level, the 60% Black representation, 60% female representation. If we look at our executive committee, 70% Black, 80% female. So, looking at that leading from the front, really, some people might say we might have swung too much in the other direction, away from kind of what we're trying to achieve in gender parity. But the first thing I think that tells you is that, there are women out there who can do this work. So if we want to think about that as a first pass, where do we find the skills? The skills are there. We need to start making sure that we apply our minds on how to find them. Then if I move over to look at the actual practices in terms of the listings requirements of listed companies, we really felt that to be able to drive transformation, diversity, and inclusion in the listed companies, that we could do this possibly to the listings requirements. Now, I need to also say that from a sustainability perspective, the JSE has included the provisions of the King Code of Corporate Governance into the listings requirements, which companies need to look at on an apply and explain basis. However, there are particularly two things, I think, that directly affect the S agenda. that are actually part of the governance mandatory disclosures. So not apply and explain in terms of King, but mandatory disclosures that have over time evolved a little bit. And where we're sitting now, we're looking at it, how do we look at the promotion of broader diversity at a board level? And in that regard, the listing requirement requires that the board of directors must have a policy on the promotion of broader diversity at a board level. Specifically, it says on the promotion of diversity attributes, gender, race, culture, age, skills, and experience. It also then goes on further to say that the issuer must confirm this by reporting annually in its annual report on how the board of directors or the nominations committee, as the case may be, has considered and applied the policy of broad diversity in the nomination and appointment of directors. So you can see quite specific. You need to think about this, and you need to report on how you've considered this. If applicable, it must also explain why any of the above diversity indicators have not been applied, and then further report on progress in respect thereof, if they've set, for example, voluntary targets. So in that regard, I think it's quite clear where we're starting to see that. The other one that perhaps is not as obvious that I would like to touch on is the requirement that companies need to put to vote annually their remuneration policies. Now, when you take that a step back and you think about the fact that this is a country that is considered to have the largest Gini coefficient in the world, so indicator of inequality, right? That remuneration practices actually are significantly important in relation to inclusion, economic inclusion, to being able to bridge elements of inequality as well. So, Fikile, those would be the two main aspects I'd like to focus on in relation to the second on putting to vote annually the remuneration policy. The requirement goes on further to say that if 25% or more of your shareholders vote against the policy that is put to the AGM, then the company is obliged to engage with the dissenting voters and in its next annual report actually sort of report on what the outcome of that engagement was. So you can see that we're trying to do it from that perspective in the listings rules, overarchingly kind of high level on what companies can do. And I think my colleagues, Carice and Rachel have already touched on a number of the softer issues, right? So we're trying to drive from that perspective what we can via listings requirements and, of course, lead by example. And then the other things, of course, come in with the softer requirements. I'm going to stop there for a minute and take questions.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, reporting is key. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it. Reporting is key. And you have to report why the targets are not met and what you plan to do with it. Now, let's touch on the sustainability strategy a little bit. What measures do you believe that companies need to put in place to ensure that they integrate and take a serious and a genuine stance on diversity and inclusion?
Thanks, Fikile. Yes, and I think, again, what Rachel and Carice have touched on really talk to the heart of how that actually changes within organizations. So first off, I mean, the diversity inclusion in organizations is both a moral and a business imperative. There's no doubt about that. And so it's important that it's driven at a policy level and be set into the company's various policies, including its recruitment strategy. Because, you measure what you treasure. So you need to be able to start saying, well, how do I start finding those measures? And if that's in policy and it affects everything I do, how I recruit and the like, those are some of the ways you can start looking at that. Maybe what I should do is just take a slight step back and look at it from a sustainability strategy perspective. When we consider sustainability strategy in its entirety, context matters. What you're considering as to what's important really is driven by the context in which you operate. And what, diversity looks like in Sweden versus what diversity needs to look like in South Africa, for example, could be two completely different things. What inclusion practices could look like here versus somewhere else could be very different. Also, I think the other area one needs to look at is your span of control. So sustainability strategy, just reflecting for a moment in its entirety, should really look at the heart of the business model and the operations of the business to say, well, how do these societal imperatives or, factors impact on my business? And so it will look at it from that perspective. Usually that's kind of a risk element, right? But then also, how does the practices that I'm entrenching within my business actually impact back on society and the environment? And often this, the shorthand for this would be double materiality, or an inside in and an inside out approach. An outside in and an inside out approach. And it's really the bringing together of those two that gives the business a real context around how it operates, both what impacts it, but also what influence it can have on changing that environment. And so taking responsibility for that and saying, well, if I exist in this context, here's the key things, whether it's national and gender imperatives, in our case, could be inequality, education, job creation and the like. And then within this model, how do I influence that? That becomes material impact that companies can then drive. So the management really needs to deliberate in achieving the business imperative, set firm targets that they can track over time with, on diversity with their businesses. And remember, it's not only about employee profile, for example, it's about how you impact your supply chain, right? That's part of your business model. Where do you get from? What do you need to do? Can you influence that supply chain in actually bettering the practices within that supply chain? The kinds of products and services that you create. The one lens would be, how could it perhaps facilitate better inclusion? If it's financial services products, financial inclusion. Have you made a deliberate effort to do that? Of course, we should look at the opposite too. Am I unwittingly creating exclusion through what I'm doing? Could I be exacerbating inequality issues, for example? And this really is the sustainability mindset when we talk about that. And then over and above that, create and this environment, like I said, that's not just about diverse employees, but look at that. How do you create strategies that drive exposure, development, grow the pool of diverse candidates, and particularly listed entities? The softer issues under that will really be where it comes together or falls apart, a lot of which has been touched on by Carice and Rachel. And so, if you really reflect on it, is that how do people feel included, heard, and that their opinions matter? It's not just the numbers game. And the final point there is really culture. And again, those elements have been touched on. Behaviors and norms which may alienate certain people. And you're never going to know unless you create deliberately the opportunity for that conversation, right? Mm-hmm. As an example, Carice touched on this to some extent, and I'm sorry that I'm repeating, but I also wanted to make the point, you've got women that coming from cultures which are highly, for example, patriarchal. And that's not unusual in a country like South Africa. Women who are not naturally outspoken might be seen from a certain culture's perspective to be non-participative if they don't speak up. Yet it might simply be the action of actively seeking out the input, which then gives them the little push that's needed to become more involved, to find a voice, and to take more active control of their career growth and development. And that's something personally I can completely relate to, is that you needed somebody who actually said, I want to hear what you have to say, and gave you that in to be able to do that. And as you practiced, you could do that. If you come from a culture where business is not discussed around the dinner table generally, and your colleague has that where they've grew up in that environment already, there's a massive difference in how you're able to relate when you step in. And so these are the things that we need to actively try to support in order to ensure better inclusion. And those practices really are the ones that I think will make sure that inclusion, diversity actually extends to the top, and who we get can stay and can ultimately lead to the total transformation we need.
Thank you, Shamila. I think as Maya Angelou once said, that it's not about what you do, but how you make others feel. I'm going to ask all the panel members to switch on their cameras. I think we are going to continue now to make it as interactive as possible. And I think I'm going to move on to diversity and inclusion and social impact. Rachel. With startup companies through NASPERS Labs, and in your role as a director of NASPERS, how has entrepreneurship driven social impact?
Thank you so much, Fikile. I also want to thank Shamila for setting the scene so beautifully. So I can answer my question in two parts. One is within the company and at the board level. So diversity and inclusion policy is a strategic imperative, and we live by it. But the core of our business is that we back local entrepreneurs who are creating platforms that solve big societal needs, for example, education, access to finance through fintech. And one of my favorites over the years is contributing to the circular economy by creating a platform where secondhand goods can find another life. So it's a bit bottom up and top down, in the sense that the board sets the policy and leads by example. I'm the chair of the nominations committee, so we evaluate every year the composition of the board in terms of all of the elements that Shamila had outlined, except that for us also diversity in terms of geography is important, because we are in about 100 countries we have operations. I'm very happy that over the last 4 years, every single new appointment was female. And the beauty of having the bottom up is also that it brings fresh ideas. For example, one business unit would say to everyone in the company, what sort of world would you like to live in? And diversity and inclusion features smack bang in the middle of that world that people would like to live in. And then the next question is, but what are we going to do about it? And then they came out with really exciting initiatives. And for me in South Africa, being able to expand what we do with entrepreneurs in different countries to South African entrepreneurs through NASPA's Foundry, where we back mostly young South African entrepreneurs that are using technology to solve big societal problems, and so create a bigger ecosystem by providing funding as well as sharing best practices. But perhaps the one that excites me the most is that how big the the youth unemployment problem and lack of education happen to be in South Africa. And often when we talk about the new technologies and the new opportunities, people say, but we have to fix the education system first. But that means if we have to wait for the education system, we'll have a generation of young people that would have not had an opportunity to develop their potential. So what we learned through NASPA's labs is that young people who are unemployed come into the program. We work with partners in education and training, and they learn digital economy skills. For example, cybersecurity, coding, digital logistics. And we then have partners in business and government who employ the graduates. The National Treasury, the banks, Amazon Cloud Computing, all of the companies who have logistics in retail, for example. And these are not temporary jobs. These are real serious jobs in the digital economy. So the good news for me is that once the opportunities are created, the young people rise to the occasion. They put in the work and they are successful. And I'm also happy to say that 67% of the graduates for the last financial year have been female.
Wow, that's great. So you're doing awesome work there.
It's expanding the ecosystem broader and broader.
That's great. Thank you. Shamila, let's go back to the rules a bit. Can you talk us through the progressive changes that have been made in the listing rules of mandate disclosure in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Certainly. Can I just check the sound? Sorry, this thing seems a little bit off.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the rules have changed, I think, over time. So if we look progressively, the first rules around this were implemented in 2015. So the effective date was 2015, and that was where we said companies were encouraged to set voluntary targets in respect of gender diversity at a board level. So firstly, you need to disclose on gender diversity and then encourage to set targets and clearly identify your policies that you have in place and your reporting. So similar provisions to what I've spoken about earlier, but basically you need to report on it. If you have targets, you need to disclose those targets and you need to disclose the policy that you have specifically on gender diversity. Then if we move on, progressing to 2017, the second set of amendments in relation to that on governance in particular was that you needed to then look at racial diversity at a board level. So again, issuers needed to set voluntary targets in respect of race diversity at a board level within a certain time frame, the JSE didn't impose what the target needed to look like or the time frame, but it said, look at this, do this, report on it. And of course, the benefit of reporting in the public domain is that it's an incentive for companies to continually do better. Okay, I don't think anybody wants to be seen when they report in the public domain to be worsening against what they said the previous year, right? So that's part of the drive that would happen, and that's part of the benefit of public disclosure on some of these issues. Then moving into 2019, and a slightly delayed provision because of COVID and the alignment with reporting timeframes and things like that. But that's when, in addition to the current requirements for mandatory policies on race and gender, we looked at saying more emphasis needed to be placed on overall board diversity, which is what I had mentioned earlier on, and that's in relation to age, gender, race, culture, qualifications, and the like. And they said that, basically the view is that to enhance diversity of views expressed and oversight at a board level, it's something becomes critical when a company, and in particularly in the instance of like charismatic directors. And we've seen some of the governance issues around this in our market, right? And so one way to start dealing with that is to really start considering, looking at diversity in all its forms. As part of the rationale, which was also interesting, is that the issue regulation team said that creating a board composed of directors with a broad range of perspectives needs to be a conscious choice by the nominations committee. Rachel touched on that. So the natural tendency to turn to existing or well-known relationships or connections when looking to identify candidates impedes diversity. And so this was from Issuer Reg. The JSE therefore amended and expanded on its current requirements on board diversity to have that mandatory policy wider diversity. And I think the rationale there was quite useful to touch on in that regard. I think the other thing I want to also just quickly acknowledge is that apart from the mandatory elements there, we also this year in June issued disclosure guidance, sustainability disclosure guidance for listed companies. And so what that did was saying, well, yes, there's probably 2 or 3 mandatory kind of disclosure points there. When you look at sustainability its entirety and the need for us to move towards more impact and outcome driven rather than a tick box kind of an ESG approach, what could we do to help our companies where these imperatives are there? I mean, even if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a 2030 agenda. We're in 2022 already. And the need for action is now and it's immediate. But what can we do to help our market understand and start to change? And so if you look at the disclosure guidance, there's more detail on certain provisions under the sort of the social indicators, talks directly about some of the why these things are important, some of the different areas in which you can look at diversity, whether it's in procurement practices, whether it's in remuneration, equity within bands, within, different elements of diversity. And so I think that's also useful to say as a guideline for people is actually look at the JSE's disclosure guidance on sustainability, apart from just the listings requirements, because that can really give you some insight as to why these things matter, because all the indicators that are set out, each of them, we've taken time to explain the rationale from the evidence for why these things matter. So hopefully what that does is move from a tick box towards this really is going to matter for business performance. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you. So it's really about impact and outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Talking about...
Yeah. Fikile, sorry, you were asking about performance. Sorry, before I forget, I just wanted to indicate that while we know there's a lot that needs to be done, there were some positives that came out of a recent study that was done. So in 2021, the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative actually looked at a number of different markets, right? So different exchanges. The JSE was the only exchange from a developing country to beat the G20 average for female representation among directors of companies traded on the bourse. Okay, so this was really interesting. We beat the G20 average as a country. The report also indicated that women held 29% of the board seats in the top 100 listed companies in South Africa. That was compared with an average of 20% on major G20 exchanges and figures of 12% in like Japan, 10% for Shanghai, 7.4% for South Korea. And South African women shared 11% of the companies, beating the G20 average of 5.5%. So while it's a good stat, we know that there's room for improvement, but I thought we should also applaud the fact that, comparatively, we actually have progressed. And so we do need more diversity and inclusion, particularly women in decision-making roles in both private sector and public sector. But let's just pause for a moment and also applaud some of the gains that we have.
Thank you. Thank you. And speaking of trends, Carice, I mean, you've lived in South Africa for 10 years. And during this time, you really worked on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in various sectors. What are the key considerations for leaders that you worked with, and really what helped them to drive inclusion and diversity agendas within their organizations?
I'll say that it's three things, right? I think there's an element of self, there's an element of why, and then there's an element of process. I think from a self perspective, leaders who are willing to be unpopular, who are willing to risk losing high performing people who are not on board with diversity and inclusion, because they say your culture is who you hire, fire, and promote. Everything else is, rubbish, right? That's where the rubber really meets the road. I think leaders who are willing to be vulnerable, admit their own shortcomings and mistakes, the limitations of their own experiences, and they don't shy away from hard conversations, and they're open to feedback and coaching and trying again, even if they make mistakes. I think from a why perspective, and Shamila already talked about this, is they gave people a really strong case for change. Like, why do we have to do this? Like, we're missing out on high quality talent. We don't look like the clients we serve. We need to be good corporate citizens. It's the right thing to do, right? I think the other thing I saw in the why element is leaders who are able to honor the past and the company's history, but who know that what got them there is not going to get them to the next level, right? So I think kind of weaving that into the why. And then the last part is just the processes, right? I always find it interesting that I think people don't approach DEI problems like they would any other strategic business problem. Use data, like figure out what is really happening and don't just go by sort of anecdotes, right? I think understanding what different groups of people need and meet them where they are, putting resources behind these efforts. I think leaders who don't say, well, this is how we've always done it and it worked, right? But who did it work for? It probably worked for a certain set of people, but is it going to work for a broader swath of people? And I'll say the last thing is just tying it to aspects of performance management, right? We've got to put some money where our mouth is, right? If we're gonna say that this really matters, I think we've got to start including it in performance management and people's evaluations and ratings, so that folks take it seriously and we're not just depending on kind of the goodness of folks' hearts. And the last point I'll just say is just skill building. This doesn't come naturally to people, so we're going to have to invest in the resources, training materials, courses, all these kinds of opportunities to build people's skills, so that they can be more inclusive leaders and teammates at the time.
Great. No, thank you. We do have time for the Q&A. We have a question. It says, this is quite interesting yet very concerning topic. If you have boy children in a world where diversity and inclusion seems to be more biased to women, not taking away the struggles that women have been enduring in the past, how is the boy child forming part of the diversity and inclusion topic while dealing with past injustices of women without repeating the same on the boy child? This is a really, really great question. And I think, to me, diversity and inclusion is about including both men and women. But Carice, can you respond to that?
Sure. I mean, you pretty much kind of summed it up. I do believe that men are an important part, right? We need men. We need everybody in this effort, right? And just because you experience maybe privilege as a man, you might not have privilege in other areas, right? So it's also about looking at intersectionality and looking at people as their full selves and not just one particular aspect. But I don't think you have to worry about your male child. He's going to be okay. the men are going to be okay. I promise. Don't you worry.
Yes, that's very true. Any closing words from Rachel and then Shamila?
Thank you, Fikile. I just want to mention to any budding entrepreneurs, mentors, whatever it is that gets you excited. Often people say, but I'm just one person. What difference can I make? I believe a lot. Just find a structure. You don't have to always reinvent the wheel, and see where what it is you bring to the table can be valuable. Thank you, Fikile.
Thank you, Rachel. Shamila.
Thanks, Fikile. So I just want to, two things quickly. There was a question there about where someone can get the report. I wasn't able to type an answer on for some reason. The report on the gender equality on boards, the global one, is at sseinitiative.org. So Sustainable Stock Exchanges, sseinitiative.org. Under the publications, there's a policy brief on gender equality. It's quite easy to find, and it was published last year. So that's the one. The second one is, I think, the closing remarks, I think we know that we all have a role to play and we need to be conscious and intentional. There's no doubt, and check our own biases. I want to point to two things. The first one is that a few years ago at the JSE, for example, internally we ran an awareness workshop that was looking at cultural norms. And what it did was made very obvious some of the phrases that are often said, some of the way we behave that's dismissive of other cultures or that even stereotypes unconsciously. And it was such a stark, the way in which the presenter did it made people so conscious about a number of biases, whether they were on gender, whether they were on race and the like. And what it did was drive home to people how simple conversations can actually be disenabling to others. And I found that to be a hugely powerful way to do it. There was an example where somebody might have said, no, I'm just going to go speak to that person because we speak the same language and the same culture. What you didn't realize is that you completely excluded this person and somehow felt that you had preferential access because you were the same. And so those sorts of conversations were the ones that really actually brought those issues to bear and made people constantly challenge how they were thinking. And it gave a safe space to do that because it let people make fun of themselves and say, this is what we need to challenge. I didn't realize how damaging that might be. The second one was around, the second one is more personal reflection, I think, on the boy child. I have two sons, age 3 and 7. And it's my constant concern is that how am I going to grow them up to not have the same prejudices, for example, that have been infiltrated that maybe I felt in my life growing up. And I've realized completely to the listener's point of view is that we need to make sure that we don't reverse this. We want to work towards equality and inclusiveness, which means that we need to do this together. And women are not going to solve this issue on their own. We need to take the men along with us, And so there's a generation now who has an opportunity to start from a clean slate. Like I constantly challenge, like my son is 7 years old, and I mean, he's quite young for this. But when you say that's behaving like a girl, what do you mean? How is a girl supposed to behave and what's the difference? So I'll leave it at that. There's so many things to talk about, but Fikile, those are the practical things I think that help us manage our unconscious biases.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Diversity matters, inclusion wins. I would like to thank you for this constructive discussion and action in the past hour. To the phenomenal panel, thank you for your insightful contribution this afternoon. And to the interactive audience, thank you for taking part in the webinar and for providing valuable input. I would like to leave you with a quote that says, when people transcend their differences and work together to achieve a common goal, greatness is possible. Thank you for your time. You will receive a copy of the presentation along with the process for claiming CPD points. My name is Fikile Mbokota, and it's been an absolute pleasure to host you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you, Fikile. Thanks all.